the warrior queen who defied colonial powers. The elegant marble halls of the Italian parliament fell into a stunned silence as the telegram was read aloud. Their mighty European army, armed with the latest rifles, artillery, and presumptions of superiority, had been utterly crushed in the mountains of East Africa. Not just defeated, but humiliated. The architect of their downfall was not some foreign general or rival European power, but a brilliant Ethiopian empress who had outmaneuvered them at every turn. Taytu Betul, the warrior queen of Ethiopia, had just changed the course of history. This is the story of how an African empress outsmarted European diplomats at their own game, commanded armies that shattered the myth of colonial invincibility, and preserved her nation's independence, while the rest of Africa fell to foreign powers. Through cunning, courage, and an unshakable vision of Ethiopian sovereignty, she would accomplish what no other African leader of her time could, sending a European army running back to their ships and forcing the continent's colonial powers to think twice before setting foot in her domain. Here is the remarkable true tale of the woman who made emperors tremble and rewrote the rules of the colonial game. The rise of Taitu, Ethiopia's sovereign legacy. By the time young Taytu drew her first breath around 1851, Ethiopia stood as an anomaly on the African continent, a nation that had not only rebuffed centuries of would-be conquerors, but had forged its own powerful civilization dating back to antiquity. While European maps labeled much of Africa as unexplored territory, Ethiopia boasted a sophisticated imperial court that had maintained diplomatic relations with Europe and the Middle East since medieval times. Its Orthodox Christian tradition traced back to the 4th century. Its monarchs claimed descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and its people had developed a written language when much of Europe was still illiterate. Into this proud kingdom, Taytu was born into the aristocratic Yeju clan, among the most powerful noble houses in the northern provinces. Her early education was extraordinary for any era. She mastered the classical Ethiopian language of Ge'ez, studied church poetry, and learned the complex art of keen, a form of Ethiopian versification that relied on intricate double meanings. While other noble girls might learn basic reading, Taytu's guardians had her tutored in Ethiopian military history and the arts of governance. She would later prove an exceptional chess player, a skill that foreshadowed her tactical brilliance. When she wasn't studying, young Taytu listened intently to the political discussions at her family's compound, absorbing lessons about power and sovereignty that would serve her well in the coming clash with Europe's imperial ambitions. The rise of Empress Taytu, strategist, diplomat, and visionary. By her third marriage, Taytu had learned that matrimony in Ethiopian nobility was more chessboard than bedchamber, a lesson that served her well when Menelik II, the ambitious governor of Shua province, sought her hand in 1883. Their union would prove more than a mere political arrangement. In Taytu, Menelik found not just a wife, but a strategic genius whose intellect matched his own expansionist vision. Within months of their marriage, foreign diplomats noted with fascination that Taytu was sitting in on major political councils, not as a silent consort, but as an active voice whose opinions carried the weight of imperial authority. When Menelik ascended to emperor in 1889, Taytu orchestrated a masterful consolidation of power that transformed her into Ethiopia's most influential empress consort in modern history. She established her own court, complete with spies and informants who kept her appraised of every political whisper in the empire. But her crowning achievement came in the founding of Addis Ababa. While others saw only empty hills, Taitu recognized the strategic value of the location near the hot springs of Filwoha. She personally selected the site for the imperial palace, designed the city's first church, and oversaw the construction of a sophisticated water management system that would sustain what would become Africa's diplomatic capital. Foreign visitors were startled to find themselves negotiating not just with the emperor, but with an empress who could debate European law, quote, ancient treaties, and spot a diplomatic trap hidden in the finest of legal print. As one Italian diplomat would later write with grudging admiration, she was the brain of the empire, while Menelik was its arm. The Italian trap, Ethiopia's defiance against deception. In May 1889, a document arrived at the Ethiopian court that would set the stage for one of history's most dramatic diplomatic confrontations. The Treaty of Wuchale, presented by eager Italian diplomats, seemed straightforward in its Italian version, a simple agreement of friendship between two sovereign nations. But Taitu, scrutinizing the Amharic translation with characteristic precision, discovered a devastating discrepancy in Article the Second. The Italian version claimed Ethiopia was obliged to conduct all foreign affairs through Italian ambassadors, effectively making the ancient empire an Italian protectorate. The Amharic version merely gave Ethiopia the option to use Italian diplomats if it chose. When challenged about this translation error, the Italian diplomats found themselves facing an empress who dismantled their arguments with surgical precision. In what became known as the Council of Bitterness, Taitu publicly humiliated the Italian negotiators by reading both versions aloud, laying bare their deception for all to hear. Her famous response cut through the diplomatic doublespeak. We are not the kind of people who like others to guide us. I would rather die than accept your protection. The Italians, unused to such direct resistance from African leaders, let alone from a woman, were stunned to silence. When they tried to press their case with veiled threats about Italy's military might, Taitu's reply became legendary in Ethiopian diplomatic history. You want other countries to see Ethiopia as a woman. A woman can't do anything, you would say? All right, let it be so. But remember, a woman's bite is worse than a lion's. Taitu's mastery, preparing Ethiopia for war. While Italian diplomats sent reassuring messages to Rome about their inevitable victory over this African nation, Taitu was orchestrating one of the most remarkable military preparations of the 19th century. Her first masterpiece was Ethiopia's military intelligence network. She deployed merchants, priests, and travelers as information gatherers, collecting detailed reports about Italian troop movements, weapon shipments, and the terrain they would have to cross. Through careful cultivation of European contacts, she even managed to acquire precise details about Italian military equipment and tactical doctrine. The transformation of Ethiopia's army came next. While Menelik focused on acquiring modern rifles and cannons through complex international deals, Taytu turned her attention to logistics, the true backbone of warfare. She established a sophisticated supply network of women who would carry water, food, and medical supplies to the troops. Her own personal contingent of soldiers trained in specialized tactics for mountain warfare, mastering the art of controlling high ground and water sources. Most crucially, she convinced Ethiopia's powerful church to frame the coming conflict not as a mere territorial dispute, but as an existential battle for Ethiopian Christianity against foreign invaders. When the Italian army finally began its advance in 1895, they weren't facing the disorganized tribal resistance they expected. Instead, they were walking into a carefully laid trap, meticulously planned by an empress who had spent years preparing for this moment. The message Taytu sent to her commanders revealed her iron resolve. They promise us their protection, but their gifts are chains. Rather than see my country's sovereignty bartered away, I will spill my own blood in Adwa. The Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia's triumph against colonization. Dawn broke over the mountains of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, revealing a sight that made Italian General Oreste Baratieri's blood run cold. The Ethiopian army had materialized on the high ground above his forces, their positions masterfully chosen to control every strategic pass. His 20,000 troops faced nearly 100,000 Ethiopian warriors, and worse still, they were running desperately short of water. Taytu's strategy of denying them access to local wells had worked perfectly. The Italians, exhausted and dehydrated, found themselves forced to fight on terrain chosen by their enemy. What followed was one of the most decisive battles in African history. While Emperor Menelik commanded the main force, Taytu personally led her elite troops in a brilliant flanking maneuver that turned the tide of battle. When the Italian forces attempted to seize the wells at Enkafta, they found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Taytu's forces, positioned on the heights, rained down devastating fire while protecting the crucial water source. As the battle reached its climax, she ordered her artillery to target the Italian command position, creating chaos in their ranks. By day's end, the Italian army had completely collapsed, thousands dead, thousands more captured, and the survivors fleeing in disarray. Among the captured equipment was a peculiar item, General Baratieri's ceremonial dress uniform, which he had packed in anticipation of a triumphant victory parade through Addis Ababa. Instead, Adwa would become the first decisive defeat of a European power by an African army in modern history, sending shockwaves through the colonial world and establishing Ethiopia as the only African nation to successfully resist European colonization. The aftermath and legacy of Adwa. The news of Adwa exploded across the global stage like a thunderclap. In Haiti, where black revolutionaries had driven out European powers a century earlier, crowds filled the streets in celebration. In colonial capitals across Africa, Europeans nervously watched their indigenous populations take note of Ethiopia's triumph. The myth of European military invincibility lay shattered in the mountains of Adwa, and Taytu's name was whispered in circles of resistance from Dakar to Zanzibar. Back in Addis Ababa, the Empress turned her attention to reshaping Ethiopia's relationship with Europe on her own terms. She orchestrated a series of diplomatic agreements that would protect Ethiopian sovereignty while carefully playing European powers against each other. When the British sought railway rights through Ethiopian territory, Taytu extracted massive concessions, demonstrating that Ethiopia would engage with Europe as an equal, not a subject. However, victory carried its own price. The political landscape began to shift as younger nobles, emboldened by success against Italy, pushed for faster modernization. In 1906, Menelik suffered a stroke, and Taytu's influence reached its peak as she essentially ruled the empire, until a coalition of modernizing nobles, concerned about her conservative principles, forced her into retirement in 1910. She spent her final years in the palace she had built, witnessing Ethiopia's transformation into a model of African independence. Through all the political turmoil that followed, one fact remained undisputed. Taytu Betul had changed the course of African history, proving that resistance to European colonization was not just possible, but achievable. She died in 1918, having witnessed something no other African monarch of her era could claim. Her nation remained proudly, defiantly independent, a beacon of sovereignty in an age of empire. The legacy of Taytu Betul and the echo of Adwa. 4 decades after Taytu's death, when Mussolini's forces finally succeeded in temporarily occupying Ethiopia in 1936, they found a nation fundamentally transformed by her legacy. The conquest required 685,000 Italian troops, modern aircraft, and poison gas, far from the easy victory once imagined by their predecessors. Even then, Ethiopian resistance never ceased, and by 1941, they had reclaimed their independence once again. In the corridors of the United Nations, Ethiopia would take its place as a founding member, the only African nation present at its creation. But perhaps Taytu's most enduring impact emerged in the 1950s and 60s, as African independence movements gained momentum. Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta explicitly cited Ethiopia's victory at Adwa in their calls for independence. When the Organization of African Unity needed a home in 1963, they chose Addis Ababa, the city Taytu had founded and fortified, as their headquarters. Today, this same city hosts the African Union, its skyline dominated by modern towers, but still anchored by the old imperial palace, where a warrior queen once outmaneuvered an empire. The spring waters of Filwoha, which first drew Taytu to this site, still flow, carrying with them the story of an empress who dared to challenge the seemingly inevitable tide of colonialism, and won.